In this video, I'll be offering you my thoughts on the new TTArtisan 23mm f1.8 autofocus lens. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the third installment in TTArtisan's autofocus lens set for APS-C cameras, the 23mm f1.8. Now last year I was able to test the 56mm f1.8 and the 35mm f1.8 lenses, and both had these similar characteristics that made them really interesting options among all the different lenses out there. Now, I'll be exploring this 23mm lens from that same perspective. The 23mm focal length is that sort of classic wide normal focal length that street and documentary photographers love so much, and Fujifilm has produced 3 XF lenses and an entire line of cameras based around this focal length, so it's definitely a popular one. So what can this $127 TTArtisan lens really bring to the table that Fujifilm and, of course, other manufacturers, for that matter, haven't brought already? Before we get into that though, a quick disclaimer as always. This lens was provided to me by TTArtisan for testing, and I do get to keep it. Now, no money has changed hands and nothing was requested of me other than getting an honest and timely review out onto this channel. Now, unfortunately that offer wasn't made until just a few days before the release, so I wasn't able to get this video out with the launch of the lens. But I have had a couple of weeks with it now, and everything in this review is based on my own experiences with the lens, and I've got a good handle on its strengths and weaknesses, so let's explore those here. Just like the other lenses in this series, the 23mm f1.8 has a lightweight metal lens body that feels really well made. Again, as with the other lenses in this series, there's no weather sealing here and no aperture ring, both of which are a little bit of a shame, but at this price point we do expect that. One thing that has changed with this lens, as well as the Mark II version of their 35mm f1.8, is the hood. Now, I really like the square lens hoods that were included with the first 2 lenses in this series, and it's a bit of a shame to see them replaced with these sort of plastic petal hoods on the new lenses. Now, the square hoods kept the lens very protected and very compact in my bag, and these new ones are just a little bit bulkier, and they don't really protect the lens from knocks or stray light, so I've just been leaving this one at home. Otherwise, just like the other lenses, I've got no complaints at all about the build quality here. It feels really solid and well built. In AFS, this lens is not the slowest and definitely not the quickest around. Now, it does have a stepping motor, so it is able to feel a little bit more confident than something like Fujifilm's original XF 23mm f1.4, but I'm not sure that it's any faster than that lens. It does feel about the same speed, it just gets there without all of the DC cordless motor wobbles. Now, when making small changes in focus distance, it's rapid and you'll barely even notice it moving. However, I have noticed that it can be a little bit slower when making large movements, such as when focusing from near to far. Now, in terms of accuracy though, it really does a great job and I haven't seen any misses. APS-C is also very accurate, but not as fast at tracking moving subjects as something like the linear motor-driven XF 23mm f1.4 RWR. Now, I did a few quick tests with face detection mode on and the camera set to release priority so that it wouldn't take an image until it could confirm focus. Now, I tracked a few different subjects with this and the camera set to 8 frames per second, with the shutter held down for about 2 seconds each time. Now, with a person walking towards me, the camera took 10 frames, with an old man pedaling on a bicycle towards me, it took 7, and with a motorcycle coming towards me quite quickly, it took only 4 images. Now, for reference, the XF 23mm f1.4 RWR doesn't slow down at all, and it keeps up with the camera's autofocus system, returning 8 frames a second, no matter the situation. But, of course, that is comparing the very best and most expensive autofocus lens to the least expensive one. But nonetheless, there are some differences. Now, overall though, I would say this lens is a good performer and the autofocus works well. It's not the fastest out there by any means, but it hasn't got in my way at any point either. Center sharpness is really good wide open. I'd even go so far as to say that it's almost on par with Fujifilm's XF 23mm f1.4 RWR in the middle of the frame. Now, sharpness does increase as the lens is stopped down to f2 and f2.8, but it's very marginal in the center, and honestly, it's so good wide open that it can actually be tough to see any differences as you stop the lens down. Corners, on the other hand, are a very messy affair. They're extremely soft wide open and have a bit of a smeared look to them. They gain a marginal amount of clarity with each aperture stop as the lenses close down, but even at f8, they're soft and retain a little bit of that smeared look. They never quite reach a level of sharpness that I would call good. Normally I save photos that aren't just test shots for other sections of my reviews, but I want to quickly look at this image to give you an idea of how that sharpness plays out in the real world. As you can see in this frame of a house, the center is really good and holds up to the scrutiny of the 40 megapixel sensor in the X-T50. However, if we pan the image to the top corner and look at the tree, the wires and the pole that are just a few meters behind the house, that softness can actually be seen even at f8. This isn't a depth of field issue, as you can see that the poles closer to the center of the frame remain sharp, despite being much farther away from the camera. There is a little blue, green, and red fringing to be seen around high contrast out of focus areas, but it mostly keeps itself out of the bokeh, and I haven't noticed it in anything but the strongest light. You will notice it around things like these tree branches here, set against snow. It's not horrible, but it's not great either. Coma and astigmatism are significant in the corners of the frame when this lens is used wide open, so it does pay to be careful when there are small light sources around. Now this mostly goes away by f4, so if you are looking to get sort of aberration-free corners, stopping the lens down is definitely the way to go. The bokeh produced by this lens is an interesting, character-filled collection of aberrations, to say the least. Now, it feels like the sort of bokeh that will make those who like to experiment very, very happy, and lovers of Zeiss lenses want to run the other way. Let's first take a look at the specular highlights. Now, wide open, they're fairly round in the center of the frame and take on a little bit of a cat's eye shape towards the corners. There's also a little bit of CA to be seen around the edges, and some additional dark lines in the inside of the highlights. As the lenses stop down to f2 and 2.8, the cat's eye shape remains present, but there's a little more of a polygonal shape to all of the specular highlights across the frame. At f4, all specular highlights across the frame suddenly take on a polygonal shape no matter where they are. This matches up with the disappearance of the coma and astigmatism, as well as the point where the sharpness begins to pick up in the corners of the frame. When used wide open, the lens produces a hefty swirl in the far corners of the frame. Now, unlike a lot of lenses with this sort of swirl, it does stick around through f2 and f2.8 as well, but by f4 it's almost completely gone, except for the extreme corners. Looking at this close-up example, we can see all of this play out in the corners of the frame. There's a unique character to the bokeh that might not please everyone, and personally I find my eye drawn to the bokeh and wondering what's going on there rather than actually looking at the subject in an example like this. And that may or may not be because I'm testing a lens and looking for things like this, but do let me know what you think about it in the comments below. Here's another example where the effect isn't quite so noticeable, and to me at least, the bokeh is a little bit more pleasing. It still doesn't quite have the lovely smoothness to it that Fujifilm's X f23mm f1.4 lenses do, but this is much nicer than the previous image in my opinion. With city lights, sunstars begin to form around f4 and they get stronger by f8. Now, they're not huge and they don't take over your image, just the way that I like them to be. Using the actual sun to create them is possible as well, but that comes with a whole host of other issues that you'll need to deal with, as we'll soon see. Flare and ghosting is significant with this lens. Everything from discoloration to loss of contrast all the way through the frame, to these interesting forked patterns and red circles are possible with this lens. Now, it could be a playground for those who really like to work with these sorts of issues, but if you're looking for a lens that has really great coatings to produce really clean images when you're working in backlight, this is definitely not the one. There's a lot to unpack with this, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth in the next section. Wide open, the lens produces a two-stop vignette in the far corners, which begins to clean up at f2.8 and is almost gone by f4. It's easy enough to correct for in post-production, and there's not a lot of detail rendered in the corners anyway, so it could just be another way to help you draw the eye to the center of the frame if you don't want to correct for it. You'll just need to be aware of it and factor it into your exposure decisions since it is so dark. 23mm is one of my favorite focal lengths to leave the house with. It's a focal length that can do just a little bit of everything, and one of the reasons that I've often taken only an X100 camera on trips in the past. This lens, while not being tiny, is small and light enough that it makes for an easy lens to carry around all day. It's somewhere in between Fujifilm's X f23mm f2 and the X f23mm f1.4 lenses in how it feels on the camera. Now, unfortunately it doesn't have an aperture ring like both of those lenses do, which is a big downside for me. Optically, it's an interesting lens for sure. As we saw in the center of the frame, it produces lovely detail and the corners are extremely soft. In fact, if you look at the images that come from this lens, you can almost see where that circle of sharpness drops off towards the edges. It's also visible in the way that the swirly bokeh renders as well. It's almost like TTArtisan corrected the central portion of the frame and just sort of left the edges to fall where they will. The way the sharpness falls off in the bokeh renders are things that I found just constantly popping into my mind all the time when I'm using this lens. Now, I'm always trying to find ways to sort of lean into these faults or make images that are actively avoiding them with my aperture choice in order to make the images that I wanted. Now, I promised earlier that we'd talk a little bit more about flare and ghosting, so where do I even start with this? It can very quickly take over an image and just completely ruin an otherwise nice shot, so it definitely pays to be cognizant of it at all times. But if you want to play with some of the effects that this lens formula offers, the good news is that it's really not hard to find. As long as you've got a relatively bright light source around, it won't be long before you start to see it popping up in your frame. One of the things I loved about some of Laowa's lenses, like the 9mm 0D and the Argus 33mm, were the red rings that were possible at certain angles. Now, this lens is also capable of a similar effect with the sun close to the edge of the frame, and at very specific angles, it can be used without too much other degradation of the images. But you've got to be really careful because, as you can see here, small changes in composition send the images from usable to a complete mess very, very quickly. Another thing that can happen with lights around the sides of the frame is these sort of forked patterns that come off the light source. Now, sometimes they can be a little bit distracting, but stopping the lens down to f2.8 or beyond removes them completely. However, I've found that at other times they can actually be used to add a little special sauce to an otherwise simple image. Of course, the aberrations aren't all good and they aren't all useful creatively. Sometimes flare and ghosting can just be completely destructive to your images and you'll want to move on. If these sort of effects are not something that you can make use of in your work and you like working in strong backlight, the absolutely beautifully coated XF23mm f1.4 RWR is the way to go, and it only costs around 7 times what this lens does. Aside from that, I haven't noticed this lens really getting in my way at all when I've been out shooting with it. Autofocus is reasonably snappy and does the job well, and when stopped down, the image quality is mostly like any other lens at this focal length, just with much softer corners. Now, there are also a whole lot of possibilities, or flaws, depending on how you look at it, with the flare and ghosting. This is one of those lenses that, like a lot of third-party offerings, is priced low and gives good but not great performance. Now, if you're looking for corner-to-corner sharpness or the best autofocus possible, then definitely going for one of Fujifilm's lenses at this point is the way to go. But if good center sharpness, interesting bokeh, unique flare and ghosting, and decent AF are good enough for your needs, this is definitely a good option. Now, I really wish that TTArtisan would include a physical aperture ring on this series of lenses, just like they did with their 27mm lens. That would really make these lenses stand out against the other budget offerings on the market and make them a far better competitor with something like Fujifilm's f2 Trinity. As it stands though, I'd say this is a lens for people who don't mind softness in the corners and want to work quite often with, some funkiness that this lens can bring with its flaws. As always, I hope you got what you were hoping for from this review, but do let me know if you have any questions about this lens in the comments below. Enjoy the upcoming slideshow, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.